And now that we have our proxy creature mesh created, we can turn this into a soft body to sculpt that into place. So I'll just type in velum configure strut soft body and connect the proxy creature to the first input. And I'm not even going to bother changing any of the parameter values on this velum cloth here. For the velum struts, I'm going to leave this alone as well, because we're just using this to create a soft body for the purposes of velum sculpting. We don't have to worry so much about this behaving physically perfectly for a simulation, as long as it kind of holds the shapes together nicely enough that we can sculpt this successfully. Now when we set up these velum rigs here, the third input of the velum constraints is where we add in our collision geometry. So we can take this Boolean environment mesh that we set up before and add that into the third input of this velum cloth here. And now finally, we can add the velum brush, which is a very cool tool that will allow us to do this sort of simulated sculpting process. This is similar to the velum solver wrapper in that the first input will be our velum geometry, second input is the constraint geometry, and the third input is the collision geometry. So now if we display the velum brush and then hit enter in the viewport to bring up the actual velum brush tool, this gives you some hints in the viewport about how you can control some of the interactivity of this velum brush. And some of these hints that it gives you in the viewport here are also visible as parameters on this actual node itself here. And I would highly encourage you to check out the docs for the velum brush. I'm not going to go into great detail on every single different type of sculpting mode and what every single parameter does here. And there are some great tips for different types of sculpting situations that you might want to check out in this documentation. And right now this is defaulting to screen space. That's what this brush shape of screen means right here. So anything within this circle and the actual screen space of our viewport is going to be affected by this brush stroke here. So that was kind of subtle. You can see as we pull things around, it's only grabbing the points in screen space. And if we pick a section that has a few different tentacles within this circle here, you can see that everything, regardless of their connectivity, is being selected there. And you can use your middle mouse wheel to create a larger or a smaller selection here. But for our purposes, I don't find this screen shape very helpful. I'm just going to undo those brush strokes that we just applied. Or instead of hitting Control Z to undo our operations, if we just want to clear out everything and start again, we can hit this Reset All Changes button, and that will give us our initial mesh once again. And instead of using the screen shape, I'm going to set this to surface, and this will allow us to move only the points that are connected to the area that we're grabbing. And right now this radius is pretty tiny, so let's turn this up quite a bit. So now if we grab one of these tentacles and drag it, you can see we have some color feedback on the points that are being affected. And this allows us to more carefully position each one of these tentacles. And right now we're using the damped simulation mode, which is essentially just going to sculpt everything in place. But we also have this option of the settle mode here. And if you turn that on, that's going to enable gravity, and this helps us to more naturally drape things with the effects of gravity. So this is really helpful for sculpting draping cloth, or in our case, draping tentacles on the terrain. So as soon as we start moving one of these tentacles here, you can see that that gravity is influencing our entire mesh. Now, you may not want the entire mesh to be affected when you're moving just one section of our creature here, so you can turn on this freeze outside option. So if we enable that parameter, then all of the points outside of the affected area will stay in place, and those won't be resimulating as we move just this one tentacle here. So for our initial sculpting, I actually don't mind this entire creature moving around as we're positioning these tentacles, but once we start to get a shape that we're liking for some of these tentacles here, then you're not going to want the nicely positioned ones to be moving around when you're trying to move some of the others. So in that case, you may want to turn on this freeze outside option. Another alternative to the freeze outside option to lock some areas into place is to hold shift and then click the middle mouse button to pin these points into place here. And you can see that option represented at the bottom of our viewport here in this hint. So that's a helpful reminder of some of the extra controls. So now that we've pinned this section there, that allows us to change the surrounding areas without affecting the portion that we like here. But I actually don't have this positioned where I want it to be yet. So I'm going to release those points by holding Control and then middle mouse clicking in that area. Another option that could potentially be helpful as we're setting up our initial sculpted positions is this live simulation option here. So when you turn that on, this is going to continuously simulate, and then we can still drag around parts of our tentacle as everything is being simulated. And this allows us to get some natural draping across the entire object as we're moving specific areas in place here. And it's up to you if you find this more convenient to work with for your initial shaping, or if you feel like you're kind of fighting the simulation. For me, I sometimes like to work with this live simulation mode at first, just until things are getting into a roughly decent shape. It allows me to more quickly just move things out of their rest position and into a more organic position here. But you can see this can be a little bit unpredictable and potentially difficult to work with when everything's moving around while you're trying to sculpt it. So now that this creature has draped along this environment in a reasonably convincing way, I think at this point I'm going to turn off this live simulation so that we can just manually position these tentacles exactly where we want them instead of having everything just moving around while we're trying to sculpt it. And as we are sculpting these soft body tentacles, you can see that it is looking a little bit messed up and mangled, and it's not doing a great job at preserving the original shapes like we would hope to see from a soft body faux simulation like we're doing with this sculpting process here. It's not necessarily a problem because we can fix it with our Delta Mush. So if you drop in that Delta Mush and connect the vellum brush to the first input, and then we can connect the proxy creature mesh to the second input for the reference geometry of that Delta Mush and display that. And you can see that this is really smoothing out a lot of those problematic shapes that we had from our raw vellum brush output, and it's totally fine to do post-processing like this to finesse the shapes. And it's doing a pretty good job at preserving all the original shapes, but there are some problem areas like you see right here where the tentacle has kind of flipped on itself, and there's really no way for a smoothing process like this Delta Mush to resolve this in a nice way. So you can't fix every problem with tools like this. Sometimes you just really need to go back and re-simulate this, or in our case, re-sculpt it. But you can get away with some pretty messy meshes that then get smoothed out with these tools. And in addition to checking out the smoothed out vellum brush results, we can also take a look at what this looks like when it's applied to the render mesh. And it's really good to check what the actual render mesh looks like as we're sculpting it, just to make sure things are working nicely. And actually, let's create a point deform first, and then connect that first input of the point deform to our original rest position geometry. This is going to be after it's put roughly into position and scaled down to size, and that should match the shape and position and size of our proxy creature. So we can connect that proxy mesh to the rest input of the point deform, and then use the smoothed out delta mush version for the deformed input on the point deform. And if you display the results, you can see our render mesh following the sculpt that we've made so far, but it is looking a little bit messy. And sometimes you can fix these issues by changing some of the point deform settings. And in some cases where we're getting bad deformations like this, we can improve things by increasing the radius of that point deform capture. But you can see if you increase that too much, you can get some pretty weird results where points are influencing rendered geometry points that they really shouldn't. So it looks like in this case we're not really benefiting from a larger radius, so I'm going to set that back down to the default of 0.1. Now another tweak that we can try is increasing the minimum points on this point deformer. So that means that when this is set to 1, that each point on the rendered geometry only needs to be influenced by 1 point on the deformer geometry, which can potentially create some shapes that aren't very smooth, and the more we increase the number of points that are influencing any given point on the rendered geo, then we're going to smooth things out a bit. So increasing this to 4 means it has to factor in at least 4 points from the deformer mesh, and that gives us a much smoother result. If we turn this up to 8 though, it doesn't necessarily give us something even smoother than that. This is giving us some strange results, so you have to be a bit careful with how many points you're using to drive the render geometry. So in this case, it looks like 4 gives us a fairly smooth result without giving us something weird like that value of 8 did. And we can also do some additional delta mushing on this deformed render geometry as well. It looks like some portions of this creature mesh are still looking a bit messy, even after the vellum brush results are delta mushed and then the render mesh is deformed. So if we create a null here for our rendered geometry before it gets point deformed, we can, actually let's look at the delta mush first. You can see that even without the render geometry input, the delta mush by itself is doing a fair amount of smoothing and cleanup on that creature body. And when we connect the render geometry as the second input, that does a better job at preserving some of the original features and shapes. So it's up to you if you want to do a more generalized smooth with the delta mush or do a version with the reference input. I've used this delta mush both ways, so feel free to try out both in your case and see which you prefer. However, even with that delta mush applied to the rendered geometry, the mesh still looks pretty messed up and has lots of artifacts on it. And this is largely due to the fact that our original geometry has lots of polygons that are made up of more than 4 sides, which isn't necessarily a huge problem when the creature isn't deforming, but once things do start to deform, when there are polygons that have more than 3 or 4 sides on them, then it's not really clear how to correctly represent those polygon faces. So it's much safer if we just convert everything to triangles or quads when we're deforming it to avoid these weird issues here. So if you add in that divide SOP, by default, the divide will set a maximum number of edges on each polygon of 3, so that triangulates everything for us. And you can see that our deformed results are looking much, much better with everything triangulated like this. So flipping back to smooth shaded, you can see there's not really any difference in the divided mesh itself visually. But when we display the point deformed mesh, there is a big difference because now this is all deforming much more nicely now that everything is made of triangles, and it's a much cleaner result overall. And perhaps just this one divide fix is enough to clean up that point deformed render geom, and looks pretty good and smooth shaded as well. It can help to check both smooth and wire shaded, of course. So it's up to you if you want to do the extra delta mushing after the point deform or not. In this case, it doesn't really look like it's making a huge difference when we do that extra delta mush, so perhaps that is an optional step. Now, because we have a delta mush after the point deform and before it, you can play around with a different number of iterations on each of those. So to perhaps smooth out the shape a bit more, we could increase the iterations just after the vellum brush. So turning that up to 30 does smooth things out quite a bit in that body area there. You can see that's preserving the smooth shape a little bit better than when that was at a lower value of 10. It looks like 30 iterations and the default step size are working pretty well for that delta mush just after the vellum brush here. And although these smoothing processes are very helpful, there are still some of these problematic areas that can't be fixed via some basic smoothing operations. So we're going to go back to our vellum brush and reset all changes, and let's strengthen those strut soft body constraints. So I'll turn that stretch stiffness up to 100. And then on the vellum brush settings, we can turn up the constraint iterations to help reinforce those struts as well. So I'll try turning that up to 200 instead of 100. And I'm also going to turn the sub steps up to 5, which will help reinforce that strut soft body behavior and improve our interactivity when brushing. Turn the simulation mode back to settle. Turn on live simulation so that drapes on the ground. And as we are resculpting these tentacles, the interactivity is working much more nicely than before. You may have noticed that as I was grabbing and dragging the mesh, oftentimes it would lose its grip essentially on that mesh, and now it's grabbing that much more nicely, much better interactivity, and we're getting better solid behavior with those tweaks that we've made. We're keeping our volume preserved much more nicely and keeping those soft body shapes. And this is working much better overall. And currently my velocity damping is set quite high, which is why we're not seeing this mesh fall to the ground despite having that live simulation on. So if we reset velocity damping back to its default, which is a low value of 0.05, now you can see that this is falling with the effect of gravity a bit more. So it's up to you if you want to really damp this down for less erratic behavior when you're sculpting it. It looks like a value just below 0.2 gives me a little bit of downward drift, but not quite enough to readily push the tentacles onto the ground. That's fine because we can just manually place these tentacles exactly where we want them and push those into the ground to sculpt this to our liking. However, you can see that even with some velocity damping, it's easy for us to push around that main body of this creature, and I really want that to just stay in place a lot better as we are sculpting the tentacles. And once this body is nicely in contact with the ground, we can use a big volume and shift middle mouse click to just pin those points in place there so that we're not pushing around this main body as we sculpt the tentacles. And so far, I've been mainly relying on the drag mode to push the tentacles around, but we also have some other brush modes that can be helpful. So if you right-click in the viewport, you can see a whole bunch of options we can set for our interactive brushing. And in addition to the drag mode here, we can also use the rotate mode. And in this mode, left-clicking will rotate the mesh clockwise around the point we've clicked, which isn't what I want in this case. I want it to go counterclockwise instead. So if you control left click, that will rotate this mesh counterclockwise. And to achieve some shapes, this will be nicer to work with than just dragging the mesh around. And as I'm sculpting these tentacles, I'm periodically flipping the display to the Delta Mesh version and to the point deformed render mesh just to make sure that the final shapes look nice, especially in some of those areas where it's a little bit crunchier. And so far everything looks good in that Delta Mesh view, so we can go ahead and keep on sculpting. Now at this point, pretty much everything is pinned into place, but I want to fix this one problematic intersection spot here, and it's not allowing me to sculpt that tentacle out of collision with the other. Doesn't really make a difference if it's in damped or subtle mode, this problem still remains, so we can try turning down the constraint iterations to allow us to push this tentacle outside of the other one without it being pulled back into place. Looks like with 100 constraint iterations, it's still pulling that into intersection with the other one. So I'm going to turn these constraint iterations all the way down to 0, which allows us to really sculpt this wherever we want it without those soft body constraints forcing it back into its previous intersecting position. So even though it's not really obeying those strut soft body constraints anymore, as long as we're being reasonable with our sculpting processes with those constraint iterations turned off, it's totally fine to do things like this when you need to spot fix certain areas where the constraints are really working against you. Now with that final tweak, I'm quite happy with all of the shapes here, and our creature sculpt is looking quite good. For display consistency, I've copied the color sop from the other creatures flying around the scene, so I'm just going to paste that in and wire it after our Delta Mesh, just so that this creature visually matches the others in the viewport. And now let's save this sculpt to disk, so drop in a file cache after this Delta Mesh result. I'll call this creature ground version 1 bgo.sc, set this to just save the current frame, turn on load from disk, and then save that out. And let's also add in a null to reference this from our render object. I'll call this render creature ground. And then we can go back to the object context and go over to our render creatures object, dive inside there. And for this creature, I'm not going to worry about blasting away the eyes because we're not trying to use them separately as lights in this case. So we can just drop in a new object merge and point this to object/creature ground and point that to the render creature ground null, and then just merge it with those other flying creatures. And it looks like in our render object, the ground creature has the color applied, but the flying ones don't have the color applied before they're merged in for rendering. So just to keep attributes consistent when the creatures are merged together like this, I'm going to go back to the creature ground setup, and instead of caching this with that darker color applied, I'm going to disconnect that, go back to the cache, save this out without the color applied, and then I'll just connect that color sop after the cache, which we can display just for our viewport purposes. And now if we go back to our wide camera and turn on the disintegration with sim geometry object as well, now we can see what all the creatures in the scene look like together.